This is sweet basil, and this is preserved sweet basil, but before I show you how to make it, we need to go back to the late summer when I first planted my basil. Because over the summer, I started my very first garden, and it didn't do so well for a number of reasons, and one of the big reasons for a lackluster harvest were the treacherous, non-relenting bugs. The essential oils of sweet basil are used in commercial insect repellents because a lot of bugs don't like the smell of basil, which is exactly why it's a great plant to include in your garden to keep some of the bugs out. Fast forward 3 months later to our December fall garden. That's right, I said fall garden in December, because it's finally cool enough that the plants don't burn in the sun, and since I live in Florida, it still hasn't gotten cold enough to freeze them. That takes us back here to today, where I noticed my basil plant starting to flower, and if you don't know, after basil flowers it'll seed off and die, which is why many people will trim off the flowers to keep their basil fresh a little longer. But being that it's almost Christmas and I have to get back to school in a few weeks, I know if I do that, I won't get anything out of the plant. The morning is when basil leaves are at their sweetest and carry the most flavor, because this is when the leaves contain the highest amounts of essential oils. That oil I was talking about that bugs don't like, well, it's that same intense flavor that makes basil so good. Which is also why basil is considered an herb and not a regular vegetable. And yes, herbs are a subset of vegetables, but it's kinda like squares and rectangles. All herbs are vegetables, but not all vegetables are herbs, and for good reason. See, you're generally not gonna eat a whole lot of an herb on its own because of how powerful its flavor is, but using it as a seasoning works wonders on your meals. Now to harvest basil, you can take it one leaf at a time, or do what I did and just cut bundles of it off, leaving the stem to continue to grow. I'm leaving some of my plant behind, and I'll explain why at the end of the video. Once you have your leaves, there are a number of ways you can preserve it, namely keeping it fresh, freezing it, or drying it. I did a bit of all three, starting with the easiest method, keeping it fresh. Basil is cool because it acts a lot like a bouquet of flowers. If you leave enough of a stem, you can stick it in a jar or a vase with just enough water to submerge the end of the stem, and this way, the stem can continue sucking up water and keeping your basil leaves fresh for up to 1 to 2 weeks. But there's a catch, because to keep it fresh, you have to cover the leaves with a plastic bag. It's important not to crush the leaves, you're just doing this to preserve them. So no, it doesn't make the best windowsill decor, but it's easy and it works. Another more boring way to keep your basil fresh is to pick off the leaves, wash and dry them, then wrap them up into a dry paper towel like this. Then comes in your trusty plastic bag to keep it fresh for 1 to 2 weeks. With both of these methods, it is important that you do not put the basil in the fridge. Fresh basil doesn't do well in fridges, so find some counter space or a cabinet instead. For the freezing and drying methods, we're going to perform a technique called blanching, aka thermal shocking the leaves. Note that this is not a necessary step, but I'll be doing it, and I'll tell you why in just a second. To blanch, boil a pot of water and have another bowl or pot of ice water handy, because we're going to be using both. Next, dip some of the basil leaves in the boiling water for 10 seconds, then transfer the leaves directly into the ice water to stop the leaves from cooking further. Then transfer the leaves into a new bin or pile and repeat the process until you've blanched all your leaves. Why do we do this? Blanching fruits or vegetables deactivates enzymes, modifies texture, and removes the peel and wilt tissue. The inactivation of enzymes preserves color, flavor, and nutritional value. Blanching also brightens your veggies by popping the air bubbles surrounding the chlorophyll, and as we all know, chlorophyll is responsible for plant photosynthesis and creates a green pigment, which is why most plants are green. For the purposes of basil, we mostly do this to keep the leaves from turning black or brown when stored for long periods of time. A little disclaimer on blanching: under blanching can actually increase enzyme action instead of deactivating it, and that can make it a lot worse than if you hadn't blanched it at all. And over blanching leads to partial cooking and causes loss of flavor, color, vitamins, and minerals, which are all those juicy things we're trying to preserve by blanching it in the first place, and is why I tried to stick as close as I could to that 10 seconds in the boiling water. Now that all of our leaves are blanched, we can dry them much like we did our fresh leaves, which I didn't show you before. It's pretty self-explanatory, you just dry the leaves. You can do this by patting them with paper towels, or if you have a salad spinner, that works too. Freezing your basil will keep much more of its flavor than drying it, so if you want that fresh flavor, but you know you aren't going to use it within a week or two, then freezing might be a good option for you. To freeze your basil, you're going to blend with just enough olive oil to make a basil puree. But since I only wanted to make enough to show you how to do it, I didn't have enough basil in my blender to actually get it to blend, which is why you can also just finely chop your basil and it'll work all the same. Once you have your blended or finely chopped basil, pack it into ice cube trays and add olive oil or water to fill in the gaps. Then pop it in the freezer. Once frozen, you can transfer the basil ice cubes into a freezer-safe bag or container and store it for up to 3 months. Did you know that the name basil comes from the Greek word basileus, meaning king? And no, I don't know if I pronounced that right. It is also attributed to the word basilisk, which is a legendary dragon that could slay a person with just one glance. As if basil wasn't cool enough already. Okay, now for my favorite preservation technique, just because it's fun and lasts the longest, you can dry basil leaves in a number of different ways depending on what you have available. I'm using the same blanched leaves I had before, and again, they don't have to be blanched, but if you don't blanch them, they'll lose their color later on. If you have a dehydrator, set it to the lowest setting or to an herb setting if yours has one. The lowest mine goes is 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Then set the timer for 16 to 24 hours depending on how moist your leaves still are. If you don't have a dehydrator but you have an oven, you can set the oven to its lowest setting, whatever that is, then lay out the leaves on a baking sheet and put it in the oven. Leave the oven door cracked open so the moisture can escape, and check on the leaves every half hour or so that they don't burn. Depending on the temperature, they could be ready in 1 to 4 hours. If you don't have an oven or you don't want to use it, I read that you could also microwave the leaves for 2 to 3 minutes, though I didn't have enough basil to try this out for myself. One last technique that takes the longest, and I also didn't do this one. If you don't have any of the above options, or you just want to do it the old-fashioned way, you can hang a bundle of leaves to air dry still on the stem. You hang them so that they're less accessible to bugs, and so that they're less likely to trap moisture underneath the leaves. For this method, it's important to hang your basil in a well-ventilated, warm, and dry spot that is not in direct sunlight. If any of these conditions are not met, you could introduce blackening or mold to your leaves. For any of these methods, you can tell when your leaves are completely dry by touching them. When the leaves feel brittle and crisp and crumble easily in your hand, then it's ready. If it's soft, there's still moisture and it needs a little longer to dry. Once your leaves are completely dry, transfer them into an airtight bag or container and store them in a dry spot. Now you can crush your basil like you see in the stores, or if you want to keep the most flavor from your dried leaves, you can store them as whole dry basil leaves instead. When you crush the leaves, they release some of their aromatic oils, so it's much better to crush them just before you plan to use them if you want to get the most flavor out of them. Dried basil can last up to 1 year or more. And that's it, you've got a bunch of ways to preserve your basil after its growing season. But before you go, there's one more basil fact that I'd like to share with you. Once the flowers bloom and dry, they create little brown pods that store seeds in them that, if harvested and stored properly, can last up to 5 years to replant in the future, and thus continuing the cycle of life of this amazing little herb. Thank you for sticking around to the end of this video. If you liked it, please let me know by hitting the like button or subscribing to my channel. I plan to make more videos like this in the future, not just on plants, but on my interests and hobbies in general, hoping to teach you a little more about the world and giving you something fun to do in your free time. Until then, I'll see you around.